1177. The scorching sands of the Levant trembled under the march of Saladin's great army. Tens of thousands of soldiers, banners, and war horses, all moving toward one single goal: to wipe Jerusalem from the map. And standing in their path, barely 500 knights, exhausted, outnumbered, and led by a king already dying from leprosy. A 16-year-old boy whose body was failing, but whose will refused to break. He gathered his last warriors, raised his banner high, and charged straight towards Saladin's army. What followed was not a miracle of God, but a miracle of courage, timing, and unshakable resolve. The day when 500 knights broke the army of Saladin. To understand the impossible odds at the Battle of Montgisard, you first have to understand the two men at the center of it all. One was at the absolute peak of his power. The other was a flickering candle in a hurricane. The first was Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Saladin. By 1177, he was the most powerful Muslim ruler in the Middle East. He had masterfully risen from a general to become the Sultan of Egypt, uniting much of the Islamic world under his banner. Saladin wasn't just a conqueror. He was a brilliant strategist and a charismatic leader who saw it as his sacred duty to reclaim Jerusalem. He'd spent years building a professional army, and now he was ready to strike a decisive blow. His opponent was a tragic contrast: Baldwin IV, the king of Jerusalem. He became king at just 13, but his reign was haunted by a horrifying secret. Baldwin had leprosy. In an age where such a disease was seen as a divine punishment, it was a catastrophic diagnosis for a warrior king. He was losing sensation in his limbs, and his hands and face were becoming disfigured. And yet, he refused to surrender. He learned to control his warhorse using only his knees, becoming a skilled rider despite his condition. He was intelligent, determined, and had an iron will that defied his decaying body. But willpower alone can't defend a kingdom, and in late 1177, the kingdom of Jerusalem was dangerously exposed. The bulk of its army was far to the north, on a campaign in Syria that had since fallen apart. This adventure stripped Jerusalem of its best commanders and soldiers, leaving the southern border, right next to Saladin's power base in Egypt, almost completely undefended. Saladin, a master of seizing the moment, saw his chance. The Leper King was isolated. The Christian army was divided. The path to Jerusalem lay wide open. It was a perfect opportunity, and he launched an all-out invasion, aiming straight for the heart of the Crusader kingdom. When news of the invasion hit Jerusalem, it wasn't just concern, it was sheer terror. One chronicler described the city as being plunged into despair. Saladin's army was a terrifying sight. A massive mobile force, possibly up to 20,000 strong, including around 1,000 of his elite Mamluks, slave soldiers trained from boyhood to be elite warriors. They crossed the desert with alarming speed, a sandstorm of steel and fury. In Jerusalem, panic reigned. The city's defenders were hundreds of miles away, but King Baldwin refused to just sit there and wait. In a desperate act of defiance, he called a general mobilization that forced every able-bodied Christian man to fight for the kingdom. The response was pitiful. Baldwin scraped together a tiny force. According to the chronicler William of Tyre, he had only 375 knights. With other troops and infantry, his total army was somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 men, the kingdom's last hope. Most commanders would have hidden behind Jerusalem's walls and prayed for a miracle. Baldwin chose another path. He made the incredibly bold decision to march his skeleton force out to meet the invasion head-on. His target was the fortress of Ascalon, a stronghold directly in Saladin's path. It was an insane gamble. As his tiny army reached the fortress, the first of Saladin's troops appeared, and Baldwin and his men were forced inside, seemingly trapping themselves. From Saladin's point of view, everything was going perfectly. The main Crusader army was gone. The Leper King and his handful of knights had locked themselves in Ascalon, where a small part of his army could keep them boxed in. As far as Saladin was concerned, the war was already won. It was this supreme confidence that led him to get careless, dangerously careless. Believing the Christian king was no threat, he didn't waste time besieging Ascalon. He left a small blockading force and marched the bulk of his army toward Jerusalem. But his arrogance bred sloppiness. Convinced he was unbeatable, he allowed his army to spread out and loot the rich countryside around Ramla, Lydda, and Arsuf. His disciplined military machine dissolved into scattered raiding parties. He was marching through enemy territory effectively blind. But inside Ascalon, the Crusaders weren't just waiting. They had been joined by about 80 Knights Templar, the most disciplined and feared heavy cavalry in Christendom. From the walls, they watched Saladin's main army march past, disorganized and overconfident. They saw the lack of discipline, they saw the scattered formations, and they saw an opportunity. It was a suicidal chance, but it was the only one they had. With the force bottling them up now much smaller, Baldwin and his knights burst out of the fortress, brushing aside the token force Saladin had left behind. They linked up with the Templars, who had sortied from nearby Gaza. Suddenly, the hunter had become the hunted. Baldwin's small, unified force was now shadowing Saladin's massive, dispersed, and blissfully unaware army. The Crusaders didn't just charge blindly. Baldwin and his commanders knew a straight-up fight on open ground was still suicide. Their only hope was to use geography to their advantage. So they shadowed the Ayyubid army, marching up the coast before cutting inland, looking for the perfect place to make a stand. They found it near a hill known as Montgisard, likely corresponding to modern Tel Safi, near Ramla. The terrain was uneven and marshy, a natural bottleneck that would force a huge army to bunch up, creating chaos in its ranks. It was the perfect place for a smaller, disciplined force to punch above its weight. On November 25th, the Crusaders caught Saladin's army in this tactical trap. The Ayyubid forces were completely unprepared, still in marching columns and struggling with the terrain. Their horses were tired from the long march and days of looting. Saladin, caught by total surprise, raced to get his men into some kind of battle line. This was the moment. Baldwin ordered the Bishop of Bethlehem to raise a piece of the true cross they had carried with them. In a moment of profound theater, the 16-year-old king was helped from his horse. He fell to the ground, prostrating himself before the relic and praying to God for victory. As he rose to his feet, his men, moved by the sight of their young, afflicted king, ready to lead them into what looked like certain death, let out a roar. With his hands bandaged to cover his sores, Baldwin was at the head of his army. The knights formed a dense, heavy cavalry wedge. With the Knights Templar at the very tip of the spear, they began a full-throated charge directly at the heart of Saladin's hastily forming lines. The shock was absolute, and the Ayyubid line shattered on impact. The Crusader charge didn't just hit the line, it punched straight through it, destroying the army's cohesion. The Ayyubid vanguard collapsed almost instantly. Panic ripped through the disorganized columns of soldiers still trying to get into position. Saladin fought desperately to restore order, but it was useless. His army was no longer a coherent fighting force. It was a panicked mob. The disciplined Knights Templar relentlessly pressed their advantage, ensuring there was no chance for a rally. Saladin's own elite Mamluk guard was thrown into a desperate melee, fighting just to protect their sultan from being killed or captured. Saladin's nephew, Taqi ad-Din's son Ahmad, was killed in the chaos. Baldwin knew winning the field wasn't enough. To save his kingdom, he had to destroy the army. As the Ayyubid lines broke, the battle turned into a ruthless 12-mile pursuit. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was a slaughter. To make matters worse, heavy rains began to fall, and local Bedouin tribes, seeing the army's weakness, attacked the survivors. The great Saladin was forced into the ultimate humiliation. He narrowly avoided capture, reportedly escaping on a swift camel with only a handful of bodyguards. The man who had set out to conquer Jerusalem was now a fugitive, fleeing for his life across the desert he had so confidently crossed just weeks before. Saladin finally reached Cairo on December 8th, but he returned in shame. The scale of the defeat was almost unbelievable. While the Crusaders suffered losses of over 1,000 killed and 750 wounded, Saladin's were catastrophic. Only about a tenth of his original invasion force made it back to Egypt. His entire baggage train was captured. Muslim historians later saw the defeat as so severe that it was only redeemed by his victory at Hattin a decade later. The news sent shockwaves through the region. For the Crusaders, it was seen as nothing short of a miracle. The kingdom's morale, which had been at rock bottom, soared. Baldwin IV, the 16-year-old Leper King, became a legend. For Saladin, it was a profound blow. His reputation for invincibility was shattered, and he learned a bitter lesson about underestimating the Franks and their young king. To commemorate the victory, Baldwin built a monastery on the battlefield dedicated to Saint Catherine, whose feast day coincided with the battle. The victory at Montgisard gave the Kingdom of Jerusalem a crucial decade of breathing room. It temporarily halted Saladin's advance and proved how resilient the Crusader state could be. But Montgisard wasn't a miracle. It was a masterclass in strategy. It showed how a brilliant commander could use speed, surprise, and terrain to neutralize a massive disadvantage. It was proof that a disciplined, determined, and well-led force could triumph over a larger, complacent one. Most of all, it was a victory born from the sheer, indomitable will of a boy king who refused to let his kingdom die. Of course, the respite was temporary. Saladin was too skilled to be broken by one defeat. He learned from his humiliation, rebuilt his armies, and would return. 10 years later, in 1187, he would get his final revenge at the Battle of Hattin, a catastrophic defeat for the Crusaders that led to the fall of Jerusalem. But that is a story for another time. The legacy of Montgisard belongs not to the eventual victor of the war, but to the victor of that single, impossible day. It belongs to the Leper King who, crippled by disease and facing annihilation, chose not to hide, but to charge headfirst into history. The Battle of Montgisard remains one of history's greatest underdog victories, a powerful lesson in leadership, strategy, and the incredible impact courage can have against overwhelming odds. What do you think? What's your favorite part of this incredible story? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to see more tactical breakdowns of history's most fascinating battles, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching.